September 15th, 1943. 08:20 hours. North African coast. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber pressed his face against the salt-crusted metal of the transport ship, watching the Tunisian shoreline disappear into the haze. 24 years old, born and raised in Hamburg, educated in the principles of National Socialism, trained to believe that capture meant torture and death at the hands of barbaric Americans. His uniform hung loose on his frame, caked with desert sand and dried sweat. 3 weeks ago, his unit had been overrun near Bizerte. 3 weeks of chaos, retreat, and finally surrender, with hands raised high while American tanks rolled past like mechanical gods. The hold of the ship stank of unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, and fear. 200 German prisoners packed together, most of them silent, some weeping quietly, others staring at nothing with the hollow eyes of men who had seen their world collapse. Friedrich had been an officer, responsible for 32 men. 19 of them were dead now, buried in African sand or blown to pieces by American artillery. The remaining 13 were scattered somewhere in this floating prison, and he had no idea if he would ever see them again. His stomach cramped with hunger. The Americans had given them water and hard biscuits, more than the Wehrmacht had provided in the final weeks of the campaign, but it was barely enough to sustain life. Friedrich remembered the propaganda films shown during training, grainy footage of Allied atrocities, lectures about the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, warnings that surrender meant certain death. Yet here he was, alive, being transported somewhere across the Atlantic. The Americans had not executed them on the beach. They had not beaten them during processing. The guards were professional, almost bored, treating the whole affair like a routine administrative task. This cognitive dissonance gnawed at Friedrich more than the hunger. Everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, suggested that this moment should not exist. He should be dead, or at least suffering unspeakable torments. Instead, he was simply uncomfortable, crowded, and confused. Gefreiter Hans Becker squeezed through the mass of bodies to stand beside Friedrich at the porthole. Hans was 36, a farmer from Bavaria, with weathered hands and a face that had seen too much sun. Before the war, he had grown wheat and raised dairy cows. Now he was a prisoner just like Friedrich, just like all of them. "How long do you think the voyage will take?" Hans asked, his Bavarian accent thick even in whispered German. 2 weeks, maybe 3, Friedrich replied. "Depends where they are taking us. America? Probably. Where else would they take so many of us?" Hans was quiet for a moment, then said, "My cousin emigrated to Wisconsin in 1936. He wrote letters about the farms there. Said the land was rich, the harvests abundant. Said Americans ate meat every day. Propaganda," Friedrich said automatically, though his voice lacked conviction. "American decadence. They are a weak people, corrupted by Jewish capitalism." Hans looked at him with an expression that might have been pity. "Friedrich, we lost. The weak people defeated us. Perhaps we should reconsider what we think we know." Friedrich had no answer to that. He turned back to the porthole and watched the empty ocean roll past. September 28th, 1943. Norfolk, Virginia. The ship docked in early morning fog, and the prisoners were herded down gangplanks onto American soil. Friedrich's legs trembled after 2 weeks at sea, and he stumbled on the pier, catching himself against a wooden post. An American soldier, young and pink-cheeked, gestured for him to keep moving. No rifle butt to the ribs, no shouted curses, just a tired wave toward the processing building. The facility was enormous, a converted warehouse with high ceilings and rows of tables, where American officers sat with clipboards and typewriters. The prisoners were divided into groups of 20 and led through a series of stations. Medical examination first. A doctor, middle-aged with gray at his temples, checked Friedrich's eyes, ears, throat, and chest with practiced efficiency. He noted something on a form, then said in accented German, "You are malnourished but otherwise healthy. You will receive proper meals starting today." Friedrich blinked. The doctor had spoken to him like a person, not an enemy, not vermin. The examination had been thorough but not degrading. Another crack in the edifice of everything he thought he knew. Next came delousing, a humiliating but necessary process. The Americans sprayed them with DDT powder, gave them rough soap and actual hot water for showers, then issued clean uniforms. Not American uniforms, but simple work clothes, denim trousers and cotton shirts with PW stenciled on the back in black paint. Prisoner of war. The Geneva Convention required identification, and the Americans were meticulous about following the rules. At the final station, Friedrich was interviewed by a captain who spoke perfect German. The questions were routine: name, rank, unit, hometown. The captain wrote everything down, then looked up and said, "You will be transported to a camp in Texas. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will be paid, and you will be fed. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Friedrich said, because what else could he say? "Good. Welcome to America, Lieutenant. I hope you find your stay educational." There was something in the captain's tone, not quite mockery but not quite sincerity either, a kind of knowing amusement, as if he understood exactly what Friedrich was thinking and found it entertaining. September 28, 1943, 1400 hours. Train transport through Virginia. The prisoners were loaded onto a passenger train, not cattle cars, actual passenger trains with seats and windows. Friedrich sat next to Hans, and both men stared out at the American countryside rolling past. Green fields stretched to the horizon, dotted with farmhouses and barns. Cattle grazed in pastures. Tractors worked the land. Small towns appeared and disappeared, each one intact, undamaged, prosperous. "No bomb craters," Hans whispered. "No rubble. No burned buildings." Friedrich nodded slowly. Hamburg had been bombed repeatedly. He had received letters from his mother describing the destruction, the fires, the bodies in the streets. His sister had been killed in a raid in July, buried under the collapsed remains of their apartment building. But here, in America, there was no war. The war was something happening far away, across oceans, not touching this land at all. A woman in a car at a railroad crossing waved at the train, just waved casually, as if a trainload of enemy prisoners was nothing remarkable. Friedrich raised his hand automatically, then felt foolish and lowered it. But the woman had already driven on, unconcerned. "They are not afraid of us," Hans observed. "They do not even think about us." "Why would they be afraid?" Friedrich said bitterly. "We are defeated. We are nothing." "No," Hans said thoughtfully. "It is not that. They were never afraid. They are too strong to be afraid. That is what we did not understand." The train rolled on through the afternoon and into the evening. The prisoners were given sandwiches, thick slices of bread with ham and cheese and apples. Real apples, crisp and sweet. Friedrich ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to remember the last time he had tasted fresh fruit. Months ago, certainly. Perhaps before the final offensive in Tunisia. September 28, 1943. 1800 hours. Camp Hearn, Texas. The camp sprawled across flat Texas prairie, row after row of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. Floodlights illuminated the compound, turning night into artificial day. The prisoners were marched through the main gate and assembled in the central yard, while an American officer read the camp rules in German. No escape attempts, no violence, no political organizing. Work assignments would begin tomorrow. Meals would be served 3 times daily. Letters home would be permitted once per month, subject to censorship. Religious services would be allowed on Sundays. Then they were dismissed to the mess hall for dinner. Friedrich had expected thin soup and stale bread, the standard rations of a defeated army. Instead, the American cooks served beef stew, thick with chunks of meat and potatoes and carrots. White bread, not the dark sawdust loaves of wartime Germany, but actual white bread with butter, milk in metal cups, coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz chicory substitute that had become standard in the Reich. Friedrich stood in line with his tray, staring at the food being ladled onto it, unable to process what he was seeing. The portions were enormous, more food than he had seen in months. He found a seat at one of the long tables and sat down mechanically, still staring. Hans sat across from him, equally stunned. Around them, 200 German prisoners ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of utensils and the occasional murmur of disbelief. Friedrich picked up his spoon and tasted the stew. The meat was tender, the broth rich and savory. He closed his eyes and felt something break inside him, some last defense against the truth. This was real. This was not a trick or a temporary measure. The Americans were feeding their prisoners better than the Wehrmacht had fed its own soldiers. He thought of his men, the ones who had died in Tunisia, who had starved slowly on inadequate rations while fighting a losing battle for a cause that now seemed increasingly hollow. They had died believing they were the master race, the superior civilization. But superior civilizations did not starve their soldiers. Superior civilizations did not lose wars to enemies they had been taught to despise as weak and decadent. Friedrich ate slowly, methodically, finishing every bite on his tray. When he was done, he felt full for the first time in months, and the sensation was almost painful. That night, lying on a clean bunk with actual sheets and a pillow, Friedrich stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile everything he had experienced with everything he had been taught. The Americans were supposed to be brutal. They were supposed to be inferior. They were supposed to be the enemy. But they had given him food, shelter, medical care, and basic human dignity. They had treated him better in one day than his own government had treated him in the final months of the war. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, Friedrich dreamed of Hamburg burning. October 3rd, 1943, Sunday afternoon, Camp Herne, Mess Hall. The first week passed in a blur of routine. Wake at 0600. Breakfast of eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. Work assignments, mostly maintenance tasks around the camp while the Americans assessed skills and fitness. Lunch at noon, usually sandwiches or soup. More work in the afternoon. Dinner at 1800. Free time until lights out at 2200. The food never diminished. Every meal was abundant, varied, and nutritious. Friedrich felt his strength returning, his body recovering from months of deprivation. Other prisoners showed the same transformation, faces filling out, energy returning, the hollow-eyed look of starvation fading. On Sunday, the Americans announced a special meal. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall, curious and slightly apprehensive. Special could mean anything. But when the American cooks emerged from the kitchen carrying large metal containers, Friedrich saw something he had not seen since before the war: ice cream. The cooks began scooping white, frozen substance into small bowls and distributing them to the prisoners. Friedrich accepted his bowl and stared at it, uncomprehending. The surface was smooth and pale, already beginning to melt slightly in the Texas heat. He had eaten ice cream as a child, before the war, before rationing, before everything changed. But that was another life, another world. Hans, sitting beside him, recognized it immediately. Ice, he breathed. They are giving us ice cream. Around them, other prisoners were having similar realizations. Some laughed in disbelief, others simply stared. One man, a corporal from Dresden, pushed his bowl away and said loudly, "It is a trick. They are trying to make us soft, to break our will. We should refuse." But most did not refuse. Friedrich picked up his spoon and took a small taste. Cold, sweet, creamy, impossibly rich. The flavor was vanilla, simple and pure. He took another spoonful, then another, eating slowly, trying to make it last. Hans ate his portion with tears running down his weathered face. "My daughter loved ice cream," he said quietly. "Before the war, I would take her to the shop in town on Sundays. She would always choose strawberry. I wonder if she remembers. I wonder if she is still alive." Friedrich had no answer. He finished his ice cream in silence, scraping the bowl clean, and then sat staring at the empty container. This was not a trick. This was not propaganda. This was simply what America could do, what America was. A nation so wealthy, so powerful, so industrially advanced that it could produce ice cream for prisoners of war while simultaneously fighting a global conflict on two fronts. The implications were staggering. If America could afford to give ice cream to its enemies, what else could it do? How vast were its resources? How complete would its victory be? Friedrich thought of the propaganda films, the lectures about American weakness and decadence. He thought of the promises that Germany would triumph through superior will and racial purity. He thought of all the lies he had believed, all the lies he had helped perpetuate as an officer, and he felt a deep, corrosive shame. That evening he wrote his first letter home. The Americans provided paper and pencils, and a censor would read everything before it was mailed. But Friedrich wrote anyway. He told his mother that he was alive and healthy. He told her that the Americans were treating him well. He described the food, the barracks, the routine. He did not mention the ice cream because he knew she would not believe him. He could barely believe it himself. October through December 1943. Camp Herne, Texas. The days settled into routine, but the abundance never diminished. Breakfast was always substantial: eggs, bacon or sausage, pancakes or toast, butter and jam, coffee and milk. Lunch varied: sandwiches, soup, stew, always with bread and fruit. Dinner was the largest meal: roast beef, pork chops, chicken, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and dessert. Dessert was often pie or cake, sometimes pudding, and occasionally ice cream. Friedrich gained 20 pounds in 2 months. His uniform, which had hung loose on his frame when he arrived, now fit properly. His face filled out, his strength returned, and he found himself able to work full days without exhaustion. The transformation was universal among the prisoners. Men who had arrived skeletal and weak became healthy and robust. The work assignments began in earnest in November. The Americans needed labor for the war effort, and the Geneva Convention permitted prisoners to work for wages. Friedrich was assigned to a cotton farm 30 miles from camp, along with Hans and 40 other prisoners. They were transported each morning in trucks, worked 8 hours under the supervision of American guards and the farm owner, then returned to camp in the evening. The farm owner was a man named Johnson, 60 years old with sun-darkened skin and hands like leather. He treated the German prisoners with cautious respect, showing them how to pick cotton efficiently, providing water breaks every hour, and occasionally bringing lemonade from his house on particularly hot days. Hans, with his farming background, adapted quickly and became something of a foreman among the prisoners. Johnson recognized his competence and began consulting with him about crop rotation and soil management. The two men would stand in the fields, speaking in broken English and German, gesturing at the land and nodding in mutual understanding. One afternoon in late November, Johnson's daughter, a woman in her 30s named Mary, brought fresh baked apple pie to the field. She distributed slices to the prisoners without hesitation, smiling and saying, "Y'all are working hard. Figured you deserved something sweet." Friedrich accepted his slice and ate it standing in the cotton field, watching this American woman treat enemy prisoners like hired hands, with casual kindness and no apparent fear. Mary chatted with the guards, laughed at something one of them said, then drove back to the farmhouse in a pickup truck, leaving the prisoners with pie and profound confusion. "They do not hate us," Hans observed, finishing his pie. "They do not even think about hating us. We are just workers to them, just men doing a job." "They should hate us," Friedrich said quietly. "We are the enemy. We have killed their soldiers, bombed their allies, started this war. They should hate us." "But they do not," Hans replied. "And that is what makes them strong. They can afford to be generous because they have already won. They knew they would win before the first shot was fired. We were doomed from the beginning, and we were too blind to see it." Friedrich had no argument. He returned to picking cotton, his hands moving automatically while his mind churned through uncomfortable truths. The prisoners were paid 80 cents per day for their labor, credited to accounts that they could use at the camp canteen. The canteen sold cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other small luxuries. Friedrich saved his money for the first month, then bought a notebook and began writing. Not letters, but observations, thoughts. A kind of journal documenting his transformation from believer to skeptic. He wrote about the food, the work, the treatment. He wrote about the cognitive dissonance of being treated humanely by people he had been taught to hate. He wrote about the slow, painful process of realizing that everything he had believed was a lie. In December, the Red Cross delivered parcels to the camp. Each prisoner received a box containing chocolate, canned meat, cigarettes, soap, and other supplies. The boxes came from Switzerland, neutral ground, part of the international effort to maintain civilized standards even in total war. Friedrich opened his parcel and found a bar of Swiss chocolate, real chocolate, not the ersatz substitute that had become standard in Germany. He ate one square and saved the rest, rationing it carefully, making it last. The Americans also provided recreational activities. There was a small library with books in German, a soccer field where prisoners could play matches, and weekly movie nights. The movies were American films, carefully selected propaganda showing the strength and righteousness of the Allied cause. But they were also entertainment, a break from routine, a reminder that life existed beyond the war. Friedrich watched a film about American factory workers producing tanks and planes, the assembly lines moving with mechanical precision, thousands of vehicles rolling off the production lines every day. The numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. Germany could not match this output. No nation could. America was not just winning the war through superior tactics or braver soldiers. America was winning through sheer industrial might, the ability to produce more of everything than any enemy could possibly destroy. After the movie, Friedrich returned to his barracks and lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Hans was in the next bunk, reading a letter from home that had finally arrived after months of delay. The letter was heavily censored, entire paragraphs blacked out, but Hans read it anyway, his lips moving silently. "My wife says the city is mostly rubble now," Hans said eventually. "The bombing continues, food is scarce. She asks if I am being treated well. She says she prays for me every night." "What will you tell her?" Friedrich asked. "The truth," Hans said. "That I am safer here than she is there. That the enemy feeds me better than our own government fed me. That I am beginning to understand why we lost." Friedrich nodded in the darkness. He was beginning to understand too. January 1944. Evening in the barracks, Camp Hearn, Texas. The new year brought no change in routine, but it brought news from Europe. The Americans provided newspapers, German-language editions printed for the prisoners, carefully edited to remove sensitive information but still containing enough detail to paint a picture of the war's progress. The news was uniformly bad for Germany. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Italy had surrendered. The bombing of German cities intensified. The Atlantic Wall was being prepared for an inevitable invasion. Friedrich read the newspapers and compared them to the propaganda he remembered from before his capture. The disconnect was total. German radio had promised victory, had insisted that the Reich was winning, that the Allies were on the verge of collapse. But here in an American prison camp, eating American food and reading American newspapers, the truth was unavoidable. Germany was losing, had been losing for years, and the final defeat was only a matter of time. Not all the prisoners accepted this truth. Hauptmann Otto Kraus, a career officer from Prussia, remained defiantly loyal to the Nazi cause. Otto was 42, a veteran of the First World War, a true believer in National Socialism and German racial superiority. He organized secret meetings among like-minded prisoners, maintained military discipline, and insisted that the good treatment was temporary, a psychological trick designed to break their will. One evening, Otto confronted Friedrich in the barracks. "You are becoming soft, Lieutenant. You eat their food, work their farms, accept their propaganda. You forget who you are, what you represent." Friedrich looked up from his journal. "I represent a defeated army, Captain. We lost. It is time to accept that." "We have not lost," Otto said sharply. "The war continues. The Führer has promised new weapons, wonder weapons that will turn the tide. We must maintain our faith, our discipline, our loyalty." "Faith in what?" Friedrich asked, his voice rising. "Loyalty to what? We were lied to, Captain. Everything we were told was a lie. The Americans are not weak. They are not decadent. They are stronger than we ever imagined, and they are defeating us with one hand while feeding us with the other." Otto's face flushed with anger. "You are a traitor. You have betrayed the Reich, betrayed the Führer, betrayed everything we fought for." "I fought for lies," Friedrich said quietly. "I led men to their deaths for lies, and now I am alive because the enemy is more civilized than we ever were. If that makes me a traitor, then I accept the label." Otto turned and walked away, his back rigid with fury. Several other prisoners followed him, the hardcore believers who could not or would not accept reality. But most remained, and Friedrich saw in their faces the same doubt, the same slow awakening that he had experienced. Hans, who had been listening from his bunk, said, "You made an enemy tonight." "I made an enemy when I stopped believing the lies," Friedrich replied. "Otto will never change. He will go to his grave believing in the Reich, in the Führer, in the superiority of the German race. But I cannot do that anymore. I have seen too much, learned too much. The truth is more important than loyalty to a failed cause." The barracks fell silent. Outside, the Texas night was warm and clear, stars visible through the windows. Friedrich returned to his journal and continued writing, documenting his transformation, creating a record that he hoped would survive the war. December 24th, 1944, Camp Hearn Chapel, Christmas Eve. The Americans permitted the prisoners to hold a religious service in the camp chapel, a simple wooden building with rough benches and a cross on the wall. Friedrich attended, not out of deep religious conviction, but out of a need for connection, for community, for something that felt like home. The chapel was crowded, nearly 300 prisoners packed together, singing hymns in German. The sound was beautiful and heartbreaking, voices raised in Stille Nacht, the melody echoing off the wooden walls. Friedrich sang with them, remembering Christmases before the war, his family gathered around the tree, his sister laughing at some joke, his mother serving dinner, his father reading from the Bible. His sister was dead now, killed by Allied bombs. His father had died in 1942, a heart attack brought on by stress and overwork. His mother was alone in Hamburg, surviving in the ruins, waiting for a son who might never return. Friedrich sang and felt tears on his face, grief and guilt, and a profound sense of loss. The American guard stood outside the chapel during the service, respectfully distant, not intruding on the prisoners' moment of worship. When the service ended and the prisoners filed out into the cold December night, Sergeant James Mitchell was waiting with a cart full of cigarettes and cookies. Mitchell was 35, a career soldier from Ohio, professional and fair in his dealings with the prisoners. He had never been cruel, never been unnecessarily harsh, but he had also never been friendly. He did his job, maintained discipline, and kept his distance. But tonight on Christmas Eve he smiled and said in halting German, "Frohe Weihnachten." Merry Christmas, boys. War's almost over. You'll be going home soon. The prisoners accepted the cigarettes and cookies, murmuring thanks, and Mitchell nodded and walked away, leaving them with an unexpected gift and an unexpected kindness. Friedrich stood in the cold, smoking a cigarette and eating a cookie, and felt something shift inside him. These were not barbarians. These were not the monsters of Nazi propaganda. These were ordinary men doing their duty, maintaining civilization standards even in the midst of total war. They are better than us, Hans said quietly, standing beside Friedrich. Not stronger, not richer, though they are both those things, but better, more decent, more humane. We were taught that we were the master race, but they are the ones acting like civilized human beings. Friedrich nodded slowly. I think that is the hardest truth to accept. Not that we lost, but that we deserved to lose. That we were the villains in this story, and they were the heroes. Everything is inverted from what we were taught. What will you do when the war ends? Hans asked. Go home. If there is a home to go back to. Try to rebuild. Try to forget. What about you? I think I will stay here, Hans said. Apply to remain as an agricultural worker. America needs farmers, and I am a good farmer. My family is gone. My farm is destroyed. There is nothing for me in Germany anymore. But here, I could start over. I could have a future. Friedrich considered this. The idea of staying in America, of abandoning Germany entirely, felt like betrayal. But betrayal of what? A government that had lied to him? A cause that had led millions to their deaths? A nation that had started a war it could not win and had brought ruin upon itself? Maybe you are right, Friedrich said. Maybe starting over is the only option left. They finished their cigarettes in silence and returned to the barracks where other prisoners were sharing the cookies and talking quietly about home, about the war, about the uncertain future. Spring 1945, Texas cotton fields. The work continued through the winter and into spring. Friedrich and Hans returned to Johnson's farm, picking cotton, repairing fences, maintaining equipment. The routine was comforting in its predictability, a structure that kept the mind occupied and the body tired. Johnson's daughter Mary became a regular presence, bringing water and snacks, chatting with the prisoners in broken German, asking about their families and their lives before the war. She treated them like human beings, not enemies, and her casual kindness was more powerful than any propaganda. One afternoon in April, Mary brought fresh-baked pecan pie, a Texas specialty. She distributed slices to the prisoners and guards alike, then sat on the tailgate of her truck and ate her own slice, watching the men work. Friedrich approached her during a break, holding his empty plate. Thank you for the pie, Miss Johnson. It was delicious. Mary smiled. You're welcome, Friedrich. You boys work hard. Least we can do is feed you proper. Why do you do this? Friedrich asked. We are the enemy. We have killed American soldiers. Why do you treat us with such kindness? Mary considered the question, then said, Because you're not the enemy anymore. You're just men far from home, doing what you're told, same as our boys overseas. And because treating you decent is the right thing to do, regardless of what uniform you wore. That's what makes us different, I think. We don't have to hate you to fight you, and we don't have to keep hating you after the fighting stops. Friedrich had no response to that. He thanked her again and returned to work. But her words stayed with him, echoing in his mind. In early May, news reached the camp that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Reich had collapsed, and the Allies had won total victory. The prisoners gathered in the camp yard to hear the official announcement. An American officer read the terms of surrender in German, his voice flat and professional. When he finished, there was silence. No cheers, no celebrations, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. Friedrich felt relief, grief, and a strange emptiness. The war was over. He had survived. But what had he survived for? What was left to return to? Otto Kraus stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pale and rigid. He refused to accept the announcement, insisted it was Allied propaganda, claimed that the Führer had a secret plan. But even the other hardcore believers were wavering now, the weight of reality finally crushing their delusions. Hans found Friedrich after the announcement and said simply, "It is finished." "Yes," Friedrich agreed. "It is finished." That night, Friedrich wrote his final letter home as a prisoner of war. He told his mother that the war was over, that he was alive and healthy, that he would be coming home as soon as repatriation could be arranged. He told her that he had been treated well by the Americans, that they had fed him and sheltered him and maintained his dignity even in captivity. He told her that he had learned things during his imprisonment, important things about civilization and humanity, and the cost of believing lies. He did not know if she would understand. He did not know if anyone in Germany would understand, but he wrote it anyway, creating a record, bearing witness to his transformation. May 8, 1945, VE Day. Camp Hearn, Texas. Victory in Europe Day. The Americans celebrated with a special meal, steak and potatoes and pie, and the prisoners ate in subdued silence, processing the end of everything they had known. Sergeant Mitchell made a brief speech, translated by one of the German-speaking officers. He said that the prisoners would be repatriated as soon as arrangements could be made, that they would be going home to help rebuild their country, that the war was over and it was time to look toward the future. Friedrich listened and wondered what future was possible. Germany was destroyed, occupied, divided among the victors. Millions were dead. Cities were rubble. The economy was shattered. What kind of life could be built from such ruins? But he was alive. That was something. He had survived the war, survived captivity, survived the collapse of everything he had believed. He was alive, and that meant he had a chance to do something with the years remaining to him. Hans approached him after the speech and said, "I have decided. I am staying. I have applied to remain in America as an agricultural worker. Johnson has agreed to sponsor me. I will become an American, start a new life, forget the old one." Friedrich clasped his friend's hand. "I am happy for you, Hans. Truly, you deserve a fresh start." "What about you?" Hans asked. "I am going home," Friedrich said. "Germany needs people who understand what happened, who can help prevent it from happening again. I do not know if I can make a difference, but I have to try. I owe that much to the men who died, to my sister, to everyone who suffered because of the lies we believed." Hans nodded. "Then I wish you luck, my friend, and I hope we meet again someday, in better times." They shook hands, two men who had been enemies of America and had learned through captivity what civilization truly meant. 1946 to 1947. Repatriation and return. The process of repatriation took months. The Americans were meticulous, processing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, verifying identities, screening for war criminals, arranging transportation. Friedrich waited his turn, working in the camp, eating American food, preparing himself mentally for the return to a Germany he barely recognized. In the spring of 1946, his name was finally called. He was processed out of Camp Hearn, given a set of civilian clothes and a small amount of money, and transported to a port in New York. From there, he boarded a ship bound for Europe, crossing the Atlantic in reverse, returning to the continent he had left as a prisoner 3 years earlier. The voyage was long and uncomfortable, the ship crowded with repatriated prisoners, all of them silent and withdrawn, contemplating the uncertain future. Friedrich stood on deck and watched the American coastline disappear, feeling a strange sense of loss. He had been a prisoner, but he had also been safe, fed, and treated with dignity. Now he was returning to freedom, but freedom in a destroyed land, a defeated nation, a world turned upside down. The ship docked in Bremen, and the prisoners were processed through Allied control points. Friedrich showed his papers, answered questions, and was finally released to make his own way home. Hamburg was worse than he had imagined. The city was a wasteland of rubble and burned buildings, entire neighborhoods reduced to skeletal ruins. The streets were filled with refugees, displaced persons, orphans, widows, all of them struggling to survive in the aftermath of total defeat. Friedrich found his mother living in a basement shelter sharing space with 3 other families. She was thin and gray, aged far beyond her years, but she wept when she saw him and held him with surprising strength. "You are alive," she said over and over. "You are alive. I thought you were dead. I thought I had lost everyone." Friedrich held her and said, "I am alive, Mama. The Americans kept me alive. They fed me, sheltered me, treated me well. I am alive because they followed their laws even when we did not." His mother pulled back and looked at him confused. "The Americans? But we were told they were brutal, that they tortured prisoners, that—" "We were told lies, Mama," Friedrich interrupted gently. "Everything we were told was lies. The Americans treated me better than our own army did. They gave me food, medical care, dignity. They proved that civilization means maintaining your values even when fighting enemies. That is a lesson I will never forget." His mother did not fully understand, but she accepted his words and held him again, grateful simply to have her son back. Friedrich found work in the reconstruction effort, clearing rubble, rebuilding infrastructure, helping to create something new from the ruins of the old. The work was hard and the pay was minimal, but it was purposeful, a way to contribute to the future. He thought often of his time in Camp Herne, of the food and the treatment and the slow transformation of his understanding. He thought of Hans, who had stayed in America and was now farming in Texas, building a new life in a new land. He thought of the ice cream, that first shocking taste of abundance and what it had represented. Not just wealth, but a different way of thinking, a different set of values. Otto Krause had also returned to Germany, but he remained bitter and unrepentant, clinging to Nazi ideology even in defeat. Friedrich saw him occasionally in the ruins of Hamburg, haranguing anyone who would listen about betrayal and conspiracy, insisting that Germany had been stabbed in the back, that the war could have been won if only the people had remained loyal. Friedrich avoided Otto. There was no point in arguing with a man who refused to see reality. Some people would never change, never learn, never accept responsibility for the catastrophe they had helped create. But Friedrich had changed. He had learned, and he was determined to help build a Germany that would never make the same mistakes again. 1950s. Post-war Germany. The years passed slowly. Germany rebuilt, divided now between East and West, occupied by former enemies who had become protectors. The Marshall Plan brought American aid, food, money, and expertise, helping to resurrect the shattered economy. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, began to take shape, transforming ruins into cities, poverty into prosperity. Friedrich married in 1950, a widow named Anna who had lost her first husband in the war. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and Friedrich worked as a civil engineer, helping to design and build the new Germany. But he never forgot his time as a prisoner. He kept his journal, the notebook he had filled with observations and reflections during his captivity. He read it occasionally, reminding himself of the lessons he had learned, the transformation he had undergone. In 1955, he was interviewed by a researcher studying the experiences of German POWs in American camps. The researcher asked about conditions, treatment, and psychological impact. Friedrich answered honestly, describing the food, the work, the dignity, and the cognitive dissonance of being treated humanely by enemies. "What was the most significant moment of your captivity?" the researcher asked. Friedrich thought for a long moment, then said, "The ice cream. The first time they served us ice cream. It was such a small thing, such a trivial luxury, but it represented everything. It showed us that America was not what we had been taught. It showed us that they had resources we could not imagine, that they could afford to give luxuries to prisoners while fighting a global war. It showed us that we had lost not just militarily, but morally and ideologically. That moment, that first taste of ice cream, was when I began to understand the truth. The researcher wrote this down, nodding thoughtfully. And how did that realization affect you? It saved me, Friedrich said simply. It saved me from becoming like Otto Kraus, bitter and delusional, clinging to lies because the truth was too painful. It allowed me to accept responsibility, to learn from our mistakes, to help build something better. The Americans could have treated us brutally. They had every right to after what we had done. But they chose to maintain their values, to follow their laws, to treat us as human beings. That choice made all the difference. It turned enemies into allies, hatred into understanding. It proved that civilization is not about strength or wealth, but about maintaining your principles even under the worst circumstances. The researcher thanked him and left, and Friedrich returned to his life, to his family, to his work. But the memory of that ice cream remained, a symbol of transformation, a reminder of the day he began to see the world clearly. Hamburg, Germany. Friedrich Weber was 68 years old, retired now, living in a comfortable apartment in rebuilt Hamburg. The city had risen from the ashes, modern and prosperous, bearing little resemblance to the wasteland he had returned to in 1946. Germany was whole again, reunified in spirit if not yet in fact, a democracy, a member of NATO, an ally of the United States. A young journalist came to interview him for a documentary about German POWs in America. The journalist was 25, born long after the war with no personal memory of the conflict or its aftermath. To him, World War II was history, something from textbooks and old films. Friedrich agreed to the interview and sat in his living room, surrounded by photographs of his family, his grandchildren, the life he had built from the ruins. The journalist asked the standard questions. Where were you captured? What was the camp like? How were you treated? Friedrich answered patiently, describing Camp Herne, the work on Johnson's farm, the abundance of food, the respect and dignity. Then the journalist asked, "What was the most memorable moment of your captivity?" Friedrich smiled. The same question he had been asked 30 years earlier, and gave the same answer. The ice cream. The first time they served us ice cream. It changed everything. How so? The journalist asked, leaning forward with interest. Because it showed me what civilization meant, Friedrich said. Not propaganda, not ideology, not racial theories or military strength. Civilization means treating people with dignity even when you have every reason not to. It means following your principles even when it is difficult or costly. It means being strong enough to be generous, powerful enough to be merciful. The Americans gave us ice cream not because we deserved it, but because they believed in maintaining standards, in following the Geneva Convention, in proving that they were better than we had been. And they were right. That ice cream, that simple dessert, represented everything we had failed to understand about the world. It represented the reason we lost, and the reason they won. The journalist was silent for a moment, processing this. Then he said, "Do you regret fighting for Germany?" Friedrich considered the question carefully. "I regret believing the lies. I regret not questioning what I was taught. I regret the deaths of my men, my sister, all the millions who died for nothing. But I do not regret learning the truth, even though it came through defeat and captivity. The Americans taught me more in 3 years of imprisonment than the Nazis taught me in a lifetime of propaganda. They taught me that strength without morality is tyranny, that victory without principle is hollow, that civilization is measured not by how you treat your friends, but by how you treat your enemies. Those are lessons I have tried to pass on to my children and grandchildren. Those are lessons Germany needed to learn and did learn at terrible cost." The journalist thanked him and left, and Friedrich sat alone in his living room, remembering. He remembered the desert in Tunisia, the transport ship, the arrival in Norfolk, the train through Virginia, the first meal at Camp Herne. He remembered Hans and Otto and Sergeant Mitchell and Mary Johnson and her pecan pie. He remembered the work in the cotton fields, the Christmas service, the news of surrender, the long journey home. But most of all, he remembered the ice cream, that first shocking taste of cold sweetness, the moment when everything he believed began to crumble, when the truth started to break through the lies. That moment had defined the rest of his life, had shaped the man he became. had given him the wisdom to help build a better Germany from the ruins of the old. The greatest victory, Friedrich thought, was not won on the battlefield. It was won in the mess halls and work camps and everyday interactions where Americans proved, through their actions, that civilization could survive even total war. They had defeated Germany not just with tanks and planes and industrial might, but with ice cream and dignity and the simple, radical act of treating enemies as human beings. That was the lesson. That was what he had learned. And that was what he hoped future generations would remember, that the true measure of a nation is not how it treats its friends in peacetime, but how it treats its enemies in war. America had passed that test. Germany had failed it. And the difference between those two outcomes could be tasted in a single spoonful of vanilla ice cream served on a Sunday afternoon in a Texas prison camp to a young German officer who thought he knew everything and discovered he knew nothing at all. Friedrich closed his eyes and remembered the taste, still vivid after 44 years. Cold, sweet, impossible, true. The taste of civilization, the taste of transformation, the taste of a world he had not known existed until he became a prisoner and learned finally what it meant to be free. If this story opened your eyes to a forgotten chapter of World War II, help us share these untold histories with more people. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the moments that changed our world. If you're already part of our community, drop a like to support the channel and let us know in the comments. What surprised you most about how German POWs were treated in America? If you found this valuable, share it with someone who loves history. Together we're keeping these important lessons alive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.